I'm really grateful. Thank you very much for the kind, warm welcome, Peter, and for the warm welcome we've received all the last few days. I am a bit dopey. I live in a permanent state of semi-jet lag, which an air hostess described to us recently as Jetsheimer's. So I'm forgetting things a little bit these days, and I forgot to talk to Alex properly before the service about the PowerPoint. So I hope the PowerPoint thing works. We will see. If not, it's not his fault, it's mine. Some introductory thoughts. This last year has seen more turbulent times in our world again. The extraordinary exodus of millions into Europe, moves towards and away from nuclear warfare, wars reported and almost unreported in Africa, and recently both mass terrorism in Paris and success at the Climate Change Summit, hopefully, also in Paris, to name but a few of the turbulent things that have happened this last year. I hope today's passage and our thoughts around it will help us to think about surprises and our reactions to them in 2016, with three thoughts. Firstly, surprises, secondly, a forgotten story, and thirdly, reacting to surprises. Of course, there are never any surprises to God, but to Jesus' followers, as we've read just now, his death was a huge shock. They had expected a great deliverer from political oppression. None of them had expected him to die a criminal's death in pain or humiliation or weakness. Some of them had even begun to understand that he was no ordinary human being. Alex, can we see if I can get back a bit with this? There you go. Oh no, that will do. You were right. How did you know that? I haven't even told you where to change the slides. He's on the case. Okay, I'll let you go ahead. Go forward, please do. I'll leave it with you. I'm going to ignore this. Thanks. Some of them had begun to understand that he was God, and how could God be nailed to a cross or killed in a gas chamber or put in an electric chair? It's just completely impossible to imagine, just as it would be for a practicing Muslim today or for many practicing Jewish people today, the idea that God could become human and then die in that way. And then here comes this extraordinary next, equally unexpected shock and surprise, the resurrection. Their world is turned upside down by the cross, their world is turned upside down again by the resurrection. We read in the encounter just before the reading, there's this extraordinary encounter where the two didn't recognize him. You can read about that in verses 30 and 31. But this encounter with Jesus turned their world upside down. Extraordinary events of the first century, this person, Jesus. None of this was expected, which brings us to point two, the forgotten story. This is a picture of a man called Peter Norman. Check him out online. Apparently he made a brave stand in the Olympics in 1968, where these other two won gold and bronze, or gold and silver medal in a race, and did something about the oppression of black people in their nation. They were both from the United States of America. And this Australian, though it looks as if he's just standing there, actually he's wearing a badge which is identifying with what they're doing. And he was really criticized for that back home in Australia and never recognized. His achievements, his athletic achievements, were never recognized because he took this stand. He felt this was something powerful he needed to do. In most of Europe, we have forgotten the story of the cross and the resurrection, a powerful story, which this man's life was changed for bad because he took a stand for a story that he believed in. There are consistent appeals in our continent to the underlying values that flow from the story of the cross and the resurrection. Values like freedom of conscience, human dignity, the value of people, the need for everybody to be treated equally before the law, and so on. But we've forgotten where those values come from, namely the book. I normally use my phone as a Bible, and it's not quite got the same power. I point to my phone and say, these values come from the book, but we've suffered from a sort of kind of collective amnesia. An October 19th Wall Street Journal article last year had this subtitle: "Having ignored its inheritance, Europe wonders why its house is falling apart." The article claimed that Europeans no longer believed in the things from which their beliefs sprang. Having ignored and undermined their own foundations, they wondered why their house was coming apart. A friend of mine, a man called Jeff Fountain, who used to be the European Director of Youth with a Mission, writes a weekly blog. And in his blog at the beginning of November, he wrote, "My own proposition is that the House of Europe is fast becoming a house of squatters. The squatters I'm referring to are not the migrants and refugees presently putting Europe's values to the test. No, they are the members of the dominant secular subculture of political, academic, and media elite who claim the freedoms and privileges of the European house without being willing to pay the rent. There is no definitive list," writes Jeff, "of European values, though human dignity, freedom, equality, solidarity, and democracy are often cited." So where did these values come from, asked Jeff? Where had these ideas sprung from in the first place? Is there any foundation for equality, he asks, without the recognition that we are all creatures of the one Creator, children of the same Father, members of the one human race? At what point did the idea of human dignity creep into European consciousness? Was it Greece, he asks? Was it Rome? Both of those societies had slavery. Neither had a view of human beings which could sustain the concept of universal human dignity. Is there any real alternative to the Judeo-Christian teaching that the only basis for human dignity was that humans were created in God's image? And he goes on to write, "Many Europeans are living like squatters in a house built on biblical concepts and revelation, yet denying their debt to such foundations." The story of the cross, the resurrection, the ascension, the soon-to-be returning Jesus. The Bible points again and again to the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus as pivotal in global history. And these events, this person, has revolutionized our whole continent ever since. So what does it mean then to live and proclaim the surprise now? The events of the cross and the resurrection revolutionized these early Christians and led to the world being turned upside down. And they came to understand that the scriptures had foretold these events. So you may have noticed in the reading in verses 46 and 47, he opened their minds, verse 45, so they could understand the scriptures. He told them, "This is what is written. The Christ will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day." They came to understand that all these amazing events were a fulfillment of all sorts of Old Testament prophecies. But they also came to understand that the scriptures had also prophesied, verse 47, that repentance and forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. The early Christians understood that the news of the events and their implications was for all people groups in every single generation. And they lived and proclaimed this good news, this wonderful story around the world about repentance and faith in his name and life in his name, recognizing that doing so is not an optional extra for Christians. Proclaiming, living out the good news of the cross and the resurrection is what Christians do in the light of the cross and the resurrection. It's simply what we do. Mission is not an add-on, it's part of our DNA. I'm tempted to tell a terrible joke about DNA, but I probably shouldn't, so I won't. Ask me afterwards during the coffee break. So what does it mean to live and proclaim these things now? There are massive changes in mission today, clearly. Alex, you are really on the case. I'm really impressed. We didn't go through the... yeah, anyway, I'm very impressed. Thank you very much. The world is clearly not the same as it was in the first century. Presumably, I don't need to illustrate that. But it's also not the same as it was in the 18th century, or in 1900, or in 1950, or in 1990, or even in 2010 or 2014. The world is changing rapidly. We live in a different world in 2016 than anybody has ever lived in before. So my question is the obvious one. Why do we sometimes do things the ways that they've always been done? Why don't we learn from these early Christians and do things differently as they did in their contexts in the light of this extraordinary news of the cross and the resurrection. There is an evangelical missionary alliance in the UK. It's called Global Connections. In 2011, 2012, they did some research which identified some obvious examples of changes that affect mission. Economic changes, poverty and social issues, including food and water security around the world, global warming, religion and multiculturalism, communications, migration, massive urban growth. 5 million people a month are moving into cities around the world. What's the population of Bournemouth? Bournemouth, Poole, Christchurch, 300,000 conurbation. 5 million people a month are moving into cities around the world. Imagine the impact of that. We were in Jordan, Jane and I, this last summer, and as we mentioned the other night to some of you, the population of Jordan has grown, we were told, from 5 million 5 years ago to 10 million today because of the Syrian and Iraq crisis. Imagine the pressure on the infrastructures in the nation, the roads, the schools, the hospitals. Imagine that in microcosm in cities around the world. 5 million people a month moving into cities. And there are huge changes, this research identified, in churches and mission agencies. It's a different and fast-changing world, as we know. Generations now live their lives online. Locally, in our churches in the UK, when mobiles first came in, we asked people to switch them off in services. Now we ask people to mute them and tweet news of the service while it's happening. And people check the accuracy of what's being said from the front while it's being said. Internationally, whole generations have access to information and social media. The young people in Nairobi, when knew about the Westgate shopping mall attacks in September 2013 and the Garissa University attacks in April 2015, long before any media broadcast the news. They were tweeting one another, they were sending one another IMs and through WhatsApp and all those various apps. They were letting one another know where it was safe to go and where it wasn't safe to go so that they could remain safe and keep one another informed. Access to information drove the Arab Spring. Control by ruling elites is no longer so easy. There are many cultures. There's so many changes around the world. There are many cultures represented even in a seemingly pretty monocultural town like Bournemouth. There are many cultures represented. Meanwhile, the waves of undocumented migration into Europe are not going to stop. Fences will not solve the problems. The International Organization for Migration reckons that more than a million people reached Europe through irregular means in 2015. And there are some frightening statistics around that. Religious extremism is on the increase, and woe betide any of us that think there are simple answers to that. But meantime, church growth continues apace in the Global South, and greater numbers of Global South missionaries are moving to the north. As Martin Lee of Global Connections, who will be with you in April, puts it, if you are a Christian today, the chances are, statistically, the chances are that you are Pentecostal, young, female, poor, and living in Africa, Asia, or Latin America. Martin writes, you are also the future face of world Christianity. So as Martin also asks, how is the UK church adjusting to this shift? Going back to Jordan, Lebanon. In Jordan, Lebanon, in both countries, there are a number of churches like our church, or like our churches, which are multi-generation. The people have been Christians for several generations. They are now finding growing numbers of Sunni Muslims coming into services and asking questions about the person of Jesus, disillusioned with the way they have been treated and what's going on around them, disillusioned with Islam. You have to then do things differently. You can't just do things as you did before. If you've got half your congregation who are Muslim seeking Christ and not Christian background believers. There are huge needs and opportunities in our generation. I don't know if you share my frustrations about political ignorance and naivety. I'm tempted to illustrate, but I probably shouldn't. Knowing how little I do, I'm amazed that others don't even know the little that I think I know. Maybe it's because we all know different things and we need to pool the little we know. So here are some small contributions from me as I begin to move towards closing. Starting in the UK, the Evangelical Alliance UK did some research with a bunch of others about the attitudes to Jesus and evangelism, and in the UK now. This is a very UK-specific thing. This research called Talking Jesus, and hopefully, if Alex can make the technology work, we will now see a little clip. So how many of your friends are waiting, or neighbours or work colleagues are waiting for an invitation to Alpha? The UK is really rich spiritually in many ways, or could be if we talked about Jesus, because apparently 67% of our population know a committed Christian. There remain huge gaps and huge needs, for example, especially among the under 35s. And as Steve Clifford, the General Director of the Evangelical Alliance UK, puts it, the shocking news in the research for me comes when we discover that 3 out of 5 non-Christians have never had a conversation with a practicing Christian about Jesus. Bearing in mind that apparently 67% of the population know a committed Christian. So there's lots to do here in the UK, and let's seize all the opportunities we can to talk Jesus in 2016. Please do make good use of the Alpha course coming up. But what about other countries? What about, for example, Saudi Arabia? How will Saudis hear about Jesus? How will Saudis hear about Jesus? The answer is, some of them will hear about Jesus as international students here in the UK. Pray for international students, befriend international students, make friends, welcome people. But others will, will encounter Christians as they meet Christian engineers or midwives and doctors going and working in Saudi Arabia, or Filipino housemaids, for example. Or closer to home, what about Belgium? According to Operation World, 1.2% of Belgians are evangelicals. That compares to Operation World's 8.8% for the UK, or 9% on the video. And that's far from unique for other countries in Europe or other parts of the world. France, 1% of the population is evangelical. Spain, 1%. Serbia, 0.6%. Greece, 0.4%. Japan, 0.5%. Kazakhstan, 0.7%. Libya, 0.3%. So how will 67% of people in those countries ever make a Christian friend or hear about Jesus? We have to start where we are to address that with international students, for example. But the reality is we also have many other opportunities in a very fast-changing world. It's a world in which people are taking longer in their journey to faith, starting with belonging, then moving to believing. And maybe some of you here have been coming to church for a little while, or beginning to come to church, and have not yet got all this stuff about the cross and the resurrection, but you love being part of this community, and you're on a journey towards finding Jesus. Our understanding of Christian mission has shifted from a proclamation-only model, which is we still need to retain proclamation and talking about Jesus, to a far more integrated model that cares for whole people. We now understand that coming to Christ is part of a much larger picture of God's plans of redemption for the whole of creation. The definition of long-term cross-cultural mission has changed from life to rolling programs of 2 to 5 years and an average period abroad of 10 years or less, and there's been an almost universal switch to an individual support financial model. Bible colleges, mission agencies, and churches in the West are all scrambling to catch up with the changes, and Lansdowne needs to continue to be discussing how we as churches in the UK should reinvent mission. I'm sure Martin Lee will share more about that in April. But I want to finish with this thought. At the end of Matthew 28, Jesus says, "Going into all the world, preach the gospel." Matthew is just a little bit before Luke. If you're still open at Luke, page 1062, if you flip back to page 1000, you'll see the last words recorded in Matthew's gospel are the words of Jesus as he ascended into heaven. And he says, "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I'm with you." Going, make disciples. Going into all the world, make disciples. What possibilities are there locally for you to blog or tweet about? What are your responsibilities with your neighbours or your work colleagues? What could you contribute to international student work locally? And what possibilities might there be elsewhere, even for short-term service? There are dozens of examples of opportunities to serve around the world. I had a quick glance this week at the Global Connections website to see what opportunities they were advertising from UK agencies and churches for service around the world. They list 77 jobs under administration, 18 under agriculture. Just now, UK mission opportunities in other parts of the world, in places like Saudi, or Belgium, or Greece, or Japan. Communications and missions, 75. Community and social action, 43. Education and training, 341. Engineering and technical, evangelism and discipleship, finance and legal, health and medical, hospitality and residential, marketing and fundraising, music and the arts, youth and children. Do you know that in many, many parts of the world, the majority world, about 50% of the population is under 25. That's true, for example, in the Middle East and North Africa, where unemployment is very, very high indeed. People are really struggling to make a living, and it's young people mostly. But there are opportunities for Christians to go and serve in all sorts of places from the UK. Does anybody here this morning have skills in any of these areas I've mentioned, or maybe in other areas, or an interest in any of those things, in hospitality, or in social action, or in youth or children, starting locally? Steve Clifford, the General Director of Evangelical Alliance UK, writes this: "As we enter 2016, let's do so in prayer, recognizing that we desperately need God's help to rise to the challenge of making Jesus known locally. Let's make our own response." He writes this: "A friend of mine, Cynthia, recently told me she'd read the Talking Jesus research and decided she was going to take the opportunity of her bus ride home from work to chat to the person next to her. I used to have great conversations," she said. "I just got out of the habit. Maybe like Cynthia, we can foster new God habits to make Jesus known." But please God that we don't restrict ourselves to just those sitting next to us on the bus, or that are being next to us in our neighborhood, or with whom we work, or our family members, but that we lift our eyes beyond our street and our town and our country and see the needs of and opportunities around the world for Christian service, making the story of the cross and the resurrection and its incredible implications for transformed lives as we have experienced, been privileged to begin to experience, making that known around the world. My prayer is that Lansdowne people might be known as a people that care for their neighborhood, their town, and their world.